great introduction with music and all. Thank you, Saskia. Hello, Mexico City. It's so nice to be here. It's my first time here. Yeah, what can I say? What can I say? I started my studio almost 20 years ago. I worked at some international offices, and I thought, this is so horrible. I mean, I just want to do architecture in my way. Of course, yeah, what does that even mean, you know? So over the last 20 years, I've established kind of, I would say, experimental practice. I tried many, many things, from research to theory to events to, I don't know, just trying things, messing up things, trying to articulate some of the things I find important. And I would say, you know, at the base of my practice are really two aims. And one is to represent people and cultural movements that are traditionally not represented in architecture. And if you think about that, that's actually all of us, right? Like, who gets to really design his or her own specific architecture, right? That's 1%. So I think that's really one. What does that look like? What are the ethics? What are the representations that are needed to do so? And then two, I always say I'm a feminist practice, right? The base is in feminist theory, intersectional Black feminist theory. And how do you translate that into an architectural practice? I think my aim is always to affect some kind of change in the projects that I do. If I don't see that possibility, I'm not going to do the project. And then two, how do you accommodate difference, right? And for me, difference is really articulated by thinkers like Audre Lorde or bell hooks. And kind of the exact opposite from universal man, whether it being Vitruvius man or like modular man, you know, which is a very specific man. He's a man, he has a girlfriend. You know, so that's actually a very specific person, but what if we take the margin as the center? So I'm just going to take you through some of my projects. I hope I don't run out of time, but let's see. So as I said, you know, like the last years, I've been trying to articulate also what does that mean in terms of a formal architectural language, right? It's great to have the theory as a base. It's good to do research. It's part of an intrinsic part of the process. But then, what can it look like? What can that space be? So with my partner in a vision, we've been really trying to articulate a formal language that goes beyond modernism, right? And then I think most of the time I work with very modest budgets. So for me, I'm very interested in kind of contemporary ornament, and we use graphics as a way to articulate the inner lives of, well, the people that we try to spatialize in a way. This is a project, I mean, this is a design that we made for an exhibition at the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. And basically the question was around the idea of what is a souvenir, right? We all know the Statue of Liberty is this great woman. But what does it mean if you would make a souvenir for a neighborhood as, for instance, Brownsville in Brooklyn, one of the few neighborhoods that are not gentrifying. It's a very rough neighborhood, but it's also filled with beautiful people, with beautiful murals, with spaces that are of importance to the people that live there. And we just tried to capture that in one kind of spatial souvenir that honors the basketball courts, the parks, the murals, and the vibrancy of that neighborhood. Another thing, I mean, I'm a woman, as you can see, and I was asked to design a pavilion for a graphic design museum in Sweden, and they had this lovely park, and it was basically a gift to the community, a community that is actually very diverse. And the question was, what do you want to do? And I said, look, I want to design the pavilion from the perspective of women. So over the course of a year, I worked with women in all age groups, all walks of life. On the left, a group of Assyrian women. On the other, the other side. It's basically young women were in a theater group, and we together articulated what this pavilion would have to be. So roller skating, basketball, performance, hanging out. From the Assyrian women, I learned that they changed how the Swedes used public space. Lying on the grass. Grass is actually something that you can use. But first and foremost, all the women were concerned with safety. So before we could even talk about what it should be, there had to be clear sight lines. We want to see when someone is approaching. I mean, it's weird because I also navigate space out of a safety perspective, but I never had to articulate that in architecture so specifically before working with these women. And then another thing popped up, because I love to work with paper, I love to work with models. You know, like early on when I graduated, I did so much CAD that I just messed up like my shoulder, so I just can't do a lot of computers, so I just used paper. And when the pavilion design was at some point, some iteration, I had to put in these model figures. And there were all these, there were only two women. Like one was wearing a skirt and standing, and the other, you could stick on her hand. So it was either she would stand like this, or you could put them down and she would be like this, sitting, yeah, well, you see her. Which is also something that completely annoyed me. So what I did, I asked the people of the community that we were working with to have their bodies scanned. So now we have like a huge library of 200 real bodies from that actual community who inhabit the pavilion. So here you see, it's a very nice pregnant mother who always came to the workshops. And just to kind of also make real women, it sounds like a Dove commercial, but real women part of, you know, architectural model making, let's say. Yeah, so other things, maybe a bit more serious. This is an exhibition, a landmark exhibition on the Dutch colonial, well, the Dutch slavery history, actually, at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam that I designed. And the exhibition was built up around 10 people who actually lived during Dutch slavery times. When I was asked to do it, it's also quite personal for me. Like, my grandfather's grandfather was the last person in my family to be enslaved by the Dutch. So I also felt that it was quite a big responsibility, and I'm totally running out of time. I'm just going to show you a quick video of the exhibition. So what do you do when you have to tell the stories of people who have no image, who only live in the archives, right? But at the same time, you have people who have huge power paintings, paintings that cost 180 million. So what I did, because this building is also national identity, right? So how do you even tell the stories of people there? So I created all these new spaces within the museum, and they were all spaces made out of mirrors. And another thing that was very important was to play with scale, because often we think of the Dutch colonial period or slavery as a time period, but it's also a design period and a way of doing design. So scale is very important. So for instance, these are some of the slave houses, enslaved houses on Aruba in the Dutch Caribbean. And after working in the salt fields all day, you had to kind of go into the house, lower yourself again. And on the other side, you have one of the slave forts, where there's a very distinct connotation between upstairs and downstairs, where the dungeons were dark, moist, upstairs, colorful, spacious. So those were some of the things I was trying to work with. Here you see some of the spaces I designed. So you would enter and be able to see through and see people moving behind it, but also see yourself. And it's also kind of like a way to play with the idea of these distant geographies in which this happened that we don't know about anymore. So here we have our king. He's also admiring the piece. The chandelier is made out of plantation money. It was for the people who worked on the plantations. After slavery, they threw it in the ocean, and they still wash up until today. So I made this chandelier. And behind it, you have an image of Surinamese women in one of the human exhibitions. that took place at the Museumplein in front of the Rijksmuseum. So it's also kind of a play on these different levels of freedom. And I will conclude very quickly. This is my contribution to the Venice Biennale. It was called the Multiplicity of Other. And I think really in the thinking around architecture, I think it's very important to realize that we have been designing from a very specific and singular point of view. And in doing that, we have this much knowledge. And there's a whole ocean of groups of people who have been othered, whose knowledges have not been valued, and of whom I think that we actually need all these practices, these knowledges, if we're going to be able to solve some of the 21st century issues, right? Click. So this is basically a starting point. These are 40 women who are deceased, who are at the basis of thinking that I think that we need in this century. In doing the research, we found that like a large part of them were actually assassinated. So that's also to say something about the erasure of facing. Oh, I don't know what's happening with the sound. And so we proposed a performance space. This is in the middle of the pandemic. So we proposed a performance space in which we invited different practitioners and thinkers to really figure out what kind of values we need to move forward and to design architectures that can honor, the planetary well-being. So here is the space. Of course, we were not allowed to have people there. So we have basically asked people to record their thoughts, their performances. But I also wanted people to envision kind of this rational, modernist pavilion, which is beautiful, in a different way. So through an architecture that we placed in there, that was the opposite. It was light, it was transparent. You would have to approach each other in a different way, right? So that could be like, what would an architecture that's based on different values look like? And here you see some of the speakers. They're great thinkers. Unfortunately now, at this moment, we're continuing these talks with many practitioners and developing an algorithm, a regenerative design algorithm, also to kind of, how do you translate knowledge into data, right? How do you redistribute value? I think it's something systemic, and it's also something that I find important. Yeah, I think I ran out of time, but it was lovely to speak to you. If there are any questions, let me know afterwards in the break. Thank you so much.